Dr. Christy Pretty-Franzak, and this is a video training tutorial on what not to do. Sometimes we call this a trifecta of common kindergarten readiness mistakes and how to avoid them. So here's a brief quote that'll just sort of set the context by which the rest of the training video will sort of wrap itself around. So readiness is a developmental process, largely unpredictable and highly influenced by the child's social relationships and interactions. Readiness requires a whole child perspective where individual differences are expected, valued, and celebrated. So you might want to take just a moment, pause the recording, and even really think about what do all those words mean to you? What words jump out at you? For me, things around relationship and whole child and celebrating differences really comes to the top. But each of you might have a different sort of reaction to this quote. So it might be good just to pause things for just a minute, think about it, maybe even read it to yourself, and so that you really understand the essence of what this training video is really going to be all about. And so if you think about those words I just said in terms of relationships and whole child and celebrating diversity, it really begs the question of who is ready, or maybe even better yet, what is it mean, or what does it mean, or what does it look like to be ready? And so in our work, and again, it's published in Young Exceptional Children, we've talked about readiness mistakes, and then the rest of this training video will talk about the remedies to those mistakes. But very quickly, as a brief overview for those of you that are new to this, or those of you who are coming back around to it, the first mistake is that we see readiness as a trait. It's something that's internal to the child, or a characteristic of the child, which sort of leads us to think that we can do something really about it, that we can control it, that we can rush it, that we can even determine how much of it you have and how much of it you don't. The second mistake is this idea of skills, knowledge, body parts, that they sort of come about in isolation, that we can think about just reading or just fine motor or just self-regulation. Rather than thinking about this as an integrated whole, we really see readiness in isolation or fragmented pieces. So do you have your upper and lower case letters? That's a very fragmented look at outcomes in terms of readiness. Do you know how to count to whatever it is right now that we want kids to count to? These are very isolated ways to look at outcomes around readiness. And then the third thing is that the mistake that can be made is that we really begin to value, or at least we engage in, standardization activities. And this can be around instruction, where we try to do whole group, where we try to be very prescriptive and directive. It can also be around assessment, where we engage in standardized testing of young children. And so this is this idea that a one-size-fits-all will actually work. So these are very quickly the three mistakes that my colleagues and I have highlighted in terms of readiness, that we look at readiness as a trait, that we look at outcomes related to whether or not you are ready in isolation or in fragmented body parts, and or we engage in standardization, where we look at a one-size-fits-all sort of model. So let's quickly look at what are some of the remedies, and then let's dig into each and leave with some actionable steps of what we can do. As you're making your way through this training video, feel free to fast forward, rewind, and or just pull out the chunk that you're ready to explore. So as I give you a quick overview of the remedies, be thinking about which one you're most interested in learning more about. And you might need to fast forward and learn more maybe about how to personalize, or maybe you want to think about more about this integrated whole versus starting with relationships. But as you'll learn, relationships are the active ingredient, so we don't want to hop over it without the intention of coming back. So quickly, as an overview, so you can be thinking about which ones you want to go into more deeply, the first remedy is that we look at readiness in terms of relationships. And so we really think about the interactions and the transactions that are a part of a child's daily life and daily routines, as we think about how do we support, how do we get to a point of readiness. The second remedy is that we really think about integration, not in the way that we maybe have thought about inclusion of fully integrating children, but really this notion of looking at all body parts happening concurrently, at trying to integrate the left and the right hemisphere so that there is a better connection and flow, and really understanding the impact of various mediating variables and how those other factors and variables will have a great impact on a child's readiness in terms of development and learning. And then the third readiness remedy is that we do the opposite of standardization, which is personalization, that we really think about readiness as is much more dynamic, much more flexible, and much less predictable thing that is occurring. So instead of saying that everybody will be ready by entry into kindergarten on September 1st, knowing 10 different skills, we really view development as it is. It's incredibly dynamic, it's incredibly flexible, and when we think about supporting children's readiness, that we act from a place of personalization. So now we're ready to dig into each of these remedies. I'm going to go through each of them in order: relationships, how to get to this integration or flow, and how to do this more personalized approach to both assessment and instruction. But again, you can pause, fast forward, rewind, come back, and visit each and of the 3 remedies in isolation, speaking of, or you can listen to the whole thing as a whole. So part of this readiness is always thinking about our own readiness. And so one time I was in Texas at the grocery store, and I saw these signs above these bananas, and it just, of course, struck me as completely about readiness. But it was sort of this, that we can even look at a banana and feel that we can now predict that it's ready to eat right now. It's ready in a few days. It's ready in maybe 3 or 4 days. And that might be true by how the banana looks on the outside and sort of is indicative of what you might find when you peel it. Our own readiness is equally difficult as it is for children's readiness to be predicted. It's equally hard to know if we're ready. Are our families ready? Are our schools ready? Are the community members ready? This is a much bigger question than are children ready. So you might even, before you go into any more depth about the remedies, just like we paused it with that opening quote, you might really take a minute to think about, are we really ready to have this conversation about readiness? Are we ready to think differently about the way that we've approached readiness before? Are there other team members that need to be involved in my journey as I become more ready to support children's readiness? So the first remedy is to view it as something that is happening within a series of interactions and transactions. And so we want to really be looking at the synergy between all of these different interactions and transactions. And so one of the ways that we can do that is really believing, and as I often say, Peter Pan believing, that the active ingredient is our relationships. And this really comes from what's called the toothpaste theory out of the Fred Rogers Center, and you can just Google toothpaste theory, and there's a blog and there's a video, and you can learn more about it. And so this next little part of the video is sort of how I interpret, how I do interpret, or how I've sort of translated or sort of morphed that theory into thinking about this remedy for readiness. And so this idea that relationships are all that really matters is kind of hard, because at the same time we're trying to tell ourselves that there are going to be lots of factors and lots of variables. But I think for me, when I say that relationships are all that matters, or when I say it's the active ingredient, I just want people to really Peter Pan believe, really without question, without sort of going down the wrong path ever, knowing that the relationships that we form with children are the absolute important or active ingredient. If we want children to be ready, whatever that becomes defined as for us, we really want to make sure that we get there by creating these interactions and transactions with children that are highly responsive. And what's great as a takeaway message is that it's not just us, one caregiver, one parent, though it's great to know that just one can have an impact, but it's both within the family and outside the family. All of these different interactions and transactions are what matters. So if you're looking at your slide, you want to really be thinking about as you would look at a label on some sort of medicine or some sort of even food, what is the active ingredient? It's relationships. And the purpose is to ensure that all children thrive. Not that they all know their upper and lowercase letters, but that they are really receiving a responsive, caring adult who's helping to build their hearts, their minds, and their bodies. And that without it, they're not going to flourish and they're not going to pass all these tests and they're not going to be quote unquote ready. So we really need to be present, give hugs, connect with kids, listen, be great play partners, create joy, and then of course repeat that daily so that children have multiple and varied learning opportunities to really engage, interact, and have transactions with responsive caregivers. It also might mean that we foster friendships. And so I'll just touch on this quickly. You can go to prekteachandplay.com and learn, just Google the word or search for the word friendships, and you'll see a lot more blogs and infographics and other supports about promoting friendships among children. But as we think about really these interactions and transactions and that relationships are the active ingredient, we also need to be thinking about the relationship that children have with their siblings, the relationship that children have with their peers. And so we really want to be promoting friendships among children and making sure that we're using the research that's available to us to really implement strategies and things that are super easy to do, like tell and show why helping children form friendships is important. Just spread the word to everybody. If you're interacting with children, reinforce the friendships that are beginning to develop between children. So this is again this remedy 1, which is looking at the transactions and interactions among caregivers. We want to have these strong relationships, but we also want to promote them between children. That brings us to our second remedy. So again, if you want to pause for just a minute and say, I need to spend some more time thinking about how can I promote better transactions and interactions with children? Do we have strong enough relationships being built before we even move forward with thinking about other ideas of readiness? Or maybe you're starting right here. Maybe you're starting with the second remedy, where you look at readiness outcomes that are viewed within the relationship to their mediating factors. So mediating factors or mediating variables, it just means that there's a lot of other stuff out there, some of which we can control and some of which we can't. There's biological factors, there's home and societal factors, there's school and political factors or community related issues. So all of these are at play when we think about a child's readiness. So again, we're not thinking of it as a child's trait, but as we're thinking about promoting children's growth and development. Sure, we talked a little bit about, or you can go back and listen to the part about relationships, but we also have to truly understand what some of these mediating variables are, what's going on biologically or within the gene structure of us as humans that impacts our ability to be ready or to develop and to grow. What are home and societal factors? And then again, what are school, political, or community factors? So when we really think about trying to get this integration, this whole of putting these variables into our mindset of what impact are they having? What can we really do about it? So your takeaway message or your task or your challenge here to implement remedy number 2 is to really be a champion for developmentally appropriate practices. And we've heard about DAP forever. And to some degree, we say it so often, maybe it's lost a little bit of its bite. So a couple of things, 3 in particular, that you can do to be a champion for developmentally appropriate practices. The first is we don't want to rush development. There's no evidence that rushing development ever did anyone good. And in fact, we have some evidence that rushing development is a bad thing. So we want to be really careful that we're not pushing kids, rushing, speeding up things that are not humanly possible. It takes time for kids to mature. It takes time for brains to develop. And again, we can promote, we can enhance, we can support that development and learning through our relationships, but we're not trying to rush it, race it, get somewhere faster than might be even having a positive impact on a child. The second thing we can do to be developmentally appropriate, and as we're thinking about mediating variables, is to understand the impact of stress, of trauma, of neglect. And so that might feel overwhelming immediately. It's like, I don't know how to cure poverty. I don't know how to keep every child safe. I don't know how to reduce the traumatic experiences that young children are experiencing. There's some truth to that, and it can be overwhelming, but there are times where we can have some say and we can have some control. And one of the things that we can do is create calm for children, create opportunities for children to experience calm, to become aware of what's going on in their bodies and learn to self-regulate so that they can create calm when they need to, when we're not around. So this idea of the mediating factors of stress, neglect, trauma, all of these things are true and will impact a child's growth and development. To be a champion for developmentally appropriate practices, our challenge is to create calm, to allow children to experience calm, and to foster their ability of self-awareness of what it feels like when they don't feel calm and when they do feel calm. And then the third thing we can do is this idea of integration, this idea of creating a better flow for children so that things aren't too rigid and things aren't too chaotic, that we are pulling upon what tends to be thought of as left hemisphere strengths and right hemisphere strengths within the brain, and that we're not trying to just promote one side of the brain or the other, but that the connection or the integration of those hemispheres, and so that children experience this connectivity and this flow more often, and that they become fully integrated. So even though we have all of these things at play, we have the environmental stimuli, we have the interactions, we have the genetic component, we have societal issues, we have political issues, all of these things going on, the child's own temperament. But what can we do on a day-to-day basis to really promote this flow, this integration, this wholeness for children? And those are three ways that you can be a champion for developmentally appropriate practices that really take into effect this second remedy of understanding the mediating variables. And then that brings us to the third and final remedy. There might be more, but these are three to get us started. So again, you might just be getting here as you went through the first in terms of relationships, and the second one where you're looking at mediating variables and being a champion for developmentally appropriate practice. Or maybe you're starting here. Maybe you really want to push against standardized testing, or this whole idea of group start and group stops, or that a one-size-fits-all terms of therapy or interventions that we provide to families. And so maybe you're really starting with the remedy of viewing readiness as very flexible and very dynamic. Sometimes we talk about this as being individualized, but even when we think of individualized, all these remedies can paralyze us in other ways, because then we get overwhelmed by how am I to be individualizing everything and differentiating everything for all these differences and all these cultural nuances and all these temperament nuances and my own nuances. So before we get too much shark music and get too overwhelmed with this idea of being individualized, it's really just accepting and embracing the notion that readiness is very flexible and very dynamic. And so one of the ways that we can do that is that we can understand that as children get older, we are actually looking at increasing the variability by which they unfold. So we have a lesser ability to predict when children can do certain skills the older they are. So 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds will become increasingly variable in terms of if you got 5-year-olds together, they would be even more different than when you had them together when they were 3. So that when you see them at 15, they will even be more variable. And when you see them again at 25, even more variable, meaning more different, less predictable, less the same. The way that I often think about this as well is thinking about every child as a triangle. That may or may not help, but it's really trying to say that all kids have intensive needs. All kids will struggle at some point. All kids will be on track for some skills, but they're still the same kid. And so I need to think about each child as shifting and moving, and that depending on the demands of the situation, they will actually morph and change in terms of their need or even their readiness. One of your takeaways, other than just sort of understanding that development becomes increasingly variable and really accounting for that children will have intensive needs, they will struggle, they will be on track, and yet they're the same child, is we can think about how do we remove barriers? Because sometimes we move towards standardization or whole group or becoming more directive because we get sort of nervous that we won't be able to individualize. We kind of push and morph everybody together to be able to serve them more efficiently. But when we think about removing barriers, sometimes kids will look a little easier. They'll look a little similar. They'll look a little bit not so different when we remove the barriers that were making them sort of artificially look different or artificially be difficult. So the one that we'll talk about now is looking at the function and the relevance of the toys and materials, the objects by which we engage children. And we want to really think about how functional and relevant are they? Because if we have really functional and relevant materials, many times children are able to be supported, more fully engaged, more participatory, more on track looking, just by having support given by the materials that we put out. And so the way that I encourage people to do this is sort of this idea that we have of terms of a clean sweep, or you can just think of it as 3 piles, and I'm going to rate or put objects and materials into each of 3 categories, or literally into 3 piles. So you can either just rate them on paper, or you can actually physically move objects and toys around. If you're a home visitor, you might want to go through this process with the child's family and really think about the materials that are available in the home. If you're an itinerant teacher, you might want to do this with the Head Start teacher or the community child care provider and really think together through the relevance and functionality of the materials. And if it's your classroom, you might just really dig in there and pick out a center, pick out an area of the room, and really critically think about, are the materials that we have available for children, should we keep them? Should we share them? Or should we toss them? So if you've sort of lost your way for a minute, we're at the third remedy where we're really looking at personalizing or individualizing. And we can do that in lots of different ways, but a simple fun way to do it is to make sure that the toys and materials we use are supportive of a child's needs so that they don't seem so needy. So if we keep toys that it's very clear for children what to do with the materials, they'll need us, oh, not so much. If it's clear to teaching staff or to parents what to do with the toys, then that becomes more effortless. The sort of interaction can kind of unfold more naturally because we're not worried about how to do it or what to do or how I might use these materials to enhance child's development. We want to really think about, are they accessible for a wide range of abilities? Remember, there's this increasing variability that's happening simultaneously. So if we kept up with that and made sure that the toys and materials available, kind of range in abilities. So if children are still really examining things through simple motor actions, we need to make sure that we have toys that do that. If kids are ready for cooperative imaginary play, then we make sure we have that. And if we have children with both of those abilities in our classroom or in our community, then we make sure that we have toys for that full range. And then again, we always want to think about, are they relevant for the kids being served right now? And even in a home environment, let's say that there is a new baby. And then let's say that you have cousins that come over several times during the week. Really thinking about, are these toys and materials relevant to these kids at these ages right now? And then also thinking about what kids' interests are. So you can kind of work your way through this. Keep it share it, or toss it by pausing your screen or taking a picture of the screen to know the criteria that if I pick up a book and I look at that book, is it clear to kids what to do with the book? Is it clear to the adults what to do with the book? Is it accessible for a wide range of abilities? Is it relevant? Is the story even interesting to the kids I'm serving or the kids at this age? And is it something they're interested in? And then if not, maybe think about, can I share it? Can I give it to someone else who can make use of it? And then maybe it's just, sort of worn its welcome and it's time for it to be recycled, or it's time to be tossed out because it's really not serving the kids, and it's not really promoting their development, it's not enhancing their readiness, and it's not allowing me to personalize their learning. So that in a nutshell is what we can do to really avoid making these mistakes around readiness. And so we can avoid things that look at readiness as a trait and instead look at the interactions and transactions. Remember, the active ingredient is the relationship. We can avoid looking at outcomes in fragmentation and in narrow ways and really put the whole child back together and really look for ways to be a champion of developmentally appropriate practices that doesn't try to teach skills at times when we're really rushing or racing kids, that we can really help kids become understand that those mediating factors such as stress and neglect are going to have an impact, but we can help kids by creating calm and helping them become self-aware of calm, and that we can really be thinking about how do we put the child back together, that wholeness and that integration of that more time in the flow, less time with rigidity, less time with chaos, less time with left and right, black and white, either or, but really pulling things together. And then that third remedy of personalizing or individualizing, avoiding standardization, and really embracing the diversity with which children bring, and acknowledging that that diversity, that variability will get greater at times. So hopefully this training video has helped you and your team better understand what not to do, and you can dig deeper into this trifecta of common kindergarten readiness mistakes, but most importantly, you now know how to avoid them.